Hi guys. Today we're going to be going through some book recommendations. I love learning about other areas of the world through reading. I found that reading is like the second best thing to travel. So if you can't travel somewhere, the next best thing is to read about it or read a story that takes place there. You can learn a lot about the people, the culture, the history through books. And that's one of my favorite things about reading. So given all of the conflict that has been happening in the Middle East, really most of my life, but very much lately between Israel and Gaza, and also now with the US and Iran, and all of the Arab nations surrounding Iran, I thought now would be a good time to make some recommendations for books to read to learn more about that area of the world. I'm going to recommend books that I've already read, and I'm also going to tell you what books are on my TBR in case you want to put them on your TBR. Hi, if you're new here, my name is Cass. We like to talk about all things bookish here, and make sure you subscribe so we can see you in the next one. And let's get into it. Okay, future me, real quick interruption. As I was filming this video, I realized that there are a lot of books to cover, and it's going to make this video very long. This video will be books that I've read that I can recommend. The next video will be books that I want to read to expand my knowledge on the Middle East, the history, the culture, all of that. So consistent with the title of this video, this is going to be recommendations of books I've already read, and I will follow up soon with a TBR. So the definition of the Middle East, like the borders or what people consider the Middle East, has fluctuated a lot over the years. I'm going to show you a couple of different maps. I'll put them right up here for the sake of covering all of our bases, and because some of these nearby countries are affected by Middle Eastern politics or have been involved in the past. I'm going to be working off the broadest map, which goes from Egypt and Turkey all the way over to Afghanistan. And I'm going to try to do recommendations based on the country, but there's a lot of overlapping. Again, that's part of the Middle Eastern history, politics, etc. So to start this video off, I'm going to start with Afghanistan. And I'm excited about this because one of my favorite authors of all time is Afghan American, and his name is Khaled Hosseini. I have loved his writing and his books for many years. We're talking like 15, 16 years that I've been a fan of his. He is a slow producer, meaning he's not constantly coming out with new books. He's written 3 very prominent works, which I've read all of them. I absolutely love them, and I look forward to the day that he publishes a new book. But anyways, I'm going to be talking about fiction books first, and then at the end, I will mention nonfiction books because those are going to be spread out a little bit more. So if you are unfamiliar with Khaled Hosseini's books, he is most known for The Kite Runner, which won a bunch of awards and was adapted into a movie. This was the first book I ever read that introduced me to conflict in that region of the world. I very much up until the point that I read this book, which I believe I read it in 2011. Pretty sure I read it the year that my son was born, 2011. That was the first time. Up until then, I had a very narrow, limited view of the Middle East and world politics outside of my little bubble here in the USA. And when I read that book, it changed something in me. That is a very pivotal moment for me. I get emotional just like thinking about it. Just so you guys know, I'm menopausal. My hormones are all over the place. I'm really stressed out with a lot of things going on in life, and I just like cry all the time now. So just a heads up. But this book completely changed my reading perspective and introduced me to a new way of looking at the world and a new way of looking at reading. So I'm just going to read the description off of Goodreads because I feel like it's pretty accurate. The unforgettable, heartbreaking story of the unlikely friendship between a wealthy boy and the son of his father's servant, The Kite Runner is a beautifully crafted novel set in a country that is in the process of being destroyed. It is about the power of reading, the price of betrayal, and the possibility of redemption, and an exploration of the power of fathers over sons, their love, their sacrifices, and their lies. This book took me out of my comfort zone, out of my little bubble, and it plopped me into a completely different world, a completely different lifestyle. And I'll always be grateful that I read this book. It changed me for the better, and it has influenced my reading journey permanently. So also, his writing is beautiful, like absolutely stunning. So not only does he write very poignant stories, but the writing is just so quotable, like just absolutely stunning. So it's always a wonderful experience to read one of his books. And so after reading that book, I was like, what else has he written? And I picked up A Thousand Splendid Suns. I would say The Kite Runner kind of focuses on the story of men and boys in Afghanistan. And A Thousand Splendid Suns is more of the female, like the women and girls perspective of Afghanistan during the same time period. So A Thousand Splendid Suns very much highlights the lifestyle of child marriage. So our first main character, she is 15 when she's sent to another city to marry a man who is 30 years older than her. So she's 15, he is 45. So we're following her experience. Her name is Miriam. And then almost 20 years later, Layla comes along, and also at the age of 15, she is sent to live in the same household with this man. And we follow the unique relationship that develops between Miriam and Layla, from initially feeling like competition to one another to becoming very tightly bonded, like a mother-daughter relationship, and kind of uniting in solidarity in being female in this very patriarchal and misogynistic home and country and life. This book does take place during the Taliban rule, so we see a lot what it's like to live under the Taliban, which was extremely eye-opening to me. And yeah, I remember this book even more than The Kite Runner, maybe because I'm a woman. I'm not sure, but it has stuck with me for a very long time. Here we are like 14 years later, and I still think about this book on a regular basis. If I had to pick between all of his books, I would probably say this is my number one. But I honestly love all of his writing, like everything he's ever written. And then the third book of his that I want to talk about is called And the Mountains Echoed. And if The Kite Runner is a story about men and boys, and A Thousand Splendid Suns is a story about women and girls, then And the Mountains Echoed is a story about siblings and family bonds. And this book is kind of like a saga. We are following a family, and in particular, a brother and his younger sister, who are very, very bonded. The brother feels very responsible for his little sister. And we're kind of following the struggles of this family and some things that happen due to the nature of the country. And we're exploring this bond between family members, and in particular between siblings, over a lifetime. So there is some time hopping going on in this book, bouncing back and forth between present and the past. And I love books like that. I love books that explore who people become and where they end up because of things that they have been through in their lifetime. And again, just like his other two books, this book is also stunning. I've given all three books of his 5 stars. He is one of the top authors I recommend to people. I just absolutely love him and his writing, so I would highly recommend picking up one or all of his books. The next books that I want to recommend take place in Iran, and these are both written by the same author. Her name is Marjan Kamali, and the first book is called The Stationery Shop. I read this a few years ago, and I loved it. It is a mixture of historical fiction, a second chance romance, and like a saga of like following someone throughout their entire life. And so we meet our main character in her childhood in Iran, and it starts out with like a, young coming of age love story. And then because of political developments in the country, our main character ends up immigrating to the United States. And this childhood love is, separated. And now there's a situation where they may be connecting in the future, like present day, but their future later in life. So this book I thought was very insightful. I learned a lot in a very short period about Iran and some of the history there. And it gave me insight into Iranian immigrants who come to the United States. I rated it 5 stars. I loved it. And so when she came out with the next book, which is The Lion Women of Tehran, it was like on my must read TBR. I finally just read it just a few weeks ago. And in fact, I talked about it on my February wrap up, which I will put here or down in the description box. But another 5 stars. This one, rather than following a love story, we're following 2 best friends that are women, and we're really taking a look at what life is like for Iranian women and girls in Iran over a long time period. So it starts out in the 1950s and it goes up until present day. And even though her books are not very long, I think both of them are under 300 pages, there's just so much information. It's so informative. The writing is beautiful. The characters are believable and feel very realistic. You become attached to them very quickly. You feel immersed in the story and invested. She's just a very talented writer. And I will definitely pick up anything she writes in the future. And I would highly recommend these 2 books. These 2 books and modern current events have actually sparked an interest in me in learning more about Iranian history and the people and the culture. And so I will have a bunch of books to read on my TBR when I get around to that video. But for now, I definitely recommend picking up her 2 books. The next books that I want to talk about take place in Syria. It is well known and not well known that Syria has been in a civil war for over a decade. And so even though I kind of knew this in the back of my mind, like I remember when it was first on the news, I didn't realize that it was an ongoing conflict because we don't hear about it so much anymore. It's not something our news is, constantly talking about or reporting. And I think that's where these books come in, and these authors are giving voice to the people of Syria since they aren't being represented in our current events. And so the first book I want to recommend is one of my favorite books of all time. Like Khaled Hosseini, his books, like A Thousand Splendid Suns and The Kite Runner, on my top favorite books of all time. Like that, As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Khattab. This book is one of my favorite books of all time. It definitely in my top 10. It is an experience. It is technically YA. It does not read YA. And this is a book I think about all the time and a book that I will never, ever forget. It does have some elements of like magical realism, I guess you could say. But mostly it's a telling of the civil war in Syria. And we are following our main character, who is a young woman who studied pharmacology. So she's supposed to be an expert in medication and drugs. But because of the war and all the damage that is happening around her and all of the physicians that are being killed and medical personnel that are being lost, anyone with any kind of medical experience are acting as medical providers. So she is working in a hospital, providing, first aid and medical care to people who are being injured in this civil war. And we're following her journey through her eyes of what's happening in her country, how she is surviving day to day, the trauma that is going on around her, and all that she has lost, including members of her family, and what she's willing to do to survive. And I think it's a very good look at not only the conflict that is going on in Syria, but I think it is an excellent representation of what refugees are dealing with. So no matter the country, when refugees are coming, seeking asylum, I think that this book very clearly and compassionately represents how refugees may be feeling, how they don't want to leave their homeland, how they are connected to their home, to their land. It is their heritage, but they no longer feel safe there. And because of that, they're willing to risk their roots, their homes, their lives, everything they've ever known to go to a strange foreign country because of the circumstances where they're coming from. And I think, especially as Americans, this is such a good book to read. And again, this is a book that changed my perspective on the world and just changed me as a person. And I highly, highly recommend. It's a 5-star book for me. Really good. And then the next book I want to recommend is called The Beekeeper of Aleppo. And this is, again, takes place in Syria. Again, we are following refugees. And so whereas As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow, you are mainly set in Syria. So you are spending the majority of your time in the war-torn land. In The Beekeeper of Aleppo, we are seeing a journey of what 2 parents have endured with the loss of their child because of the civil war and living in a war-torn land, and their journey in seeking refuge outside of their country And again, how torn they feel about leaving their homeland and the place where their son is buried to live, just to be able to live, because their lives are literally in danger if they stay in Syria. This is a heavy read. We are seeing it from the perspective of the father. We are seeing his grief. We are seeing the mental struggles that come with trauma, that come with war. And we're witnessing all the struggles they endure to leave their country, to be free and safe and find refuge and start over somewhere else. So, excellent read. Next, I want to talk about books that take place in Israel and Palestine. And I'm going to do this together for a very intentional purpose. If you don't know anything about the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there has been an ongoing conflict for decades. I mean, like the last 100 years, over the land that is currently designated as Israel. At one point, though, that land was considered Palestine. And this is a conflict between the Palestinian Arabs, who believe they have a right to that land, that is their heritage, and the Jewish Israelis, who believe that is their homeland, that is their heritage. And that conflict has led to somewhat of a civil war situation, despite many treaties and peace agreements happening in the past. There is a constant and ongoing struggle between the Israelis and the Arabs, the Jews and the Arabs. So, and that is currently what's also going on between Israel and Gaza. So Gaza is supposed to be the land that was drawn up as a refuge for the Palestinians. And I'm not going to go too far into that because that's not what this is about. I think you can learn about it through reading, and I am going to make some really good recommendations that will help you understand the conflict, both past and present. What I think is essential here is to read books from both sides and kind of keep it equal. What I've been doing is I've been reading books from an Israeli standpoint, and then I will read a book from a Palestinian author. And I have kind of been going back and forth because you're definitely getting two very different sides of the story. They are very obviously biased on their own sides. And rather than having, reading biased work and kind of being influenced in that way, I think that reading them, going back and forth between the two perspectives, is maintaining some sort of balance and helping me to get a better picture of what both sets of people feel, how they feel about the land, how they feel about each other. There are definitely discrepancies in the histories, but I think that when you read both sides and you go back and forth, you get a generally accurate picture of what has gone on and can have a little more of a neutral viewpoint. I'm trying to remain neutral as I read all of these accounts. And what really has struck me the most is, like most books that I read about war, including historical fiction with World War II, what I'm finding is, sorry, my dogs keep barking. What I'm finding is that over and over I read these books and I come to the conclusion that we are more alike than we are different. And that there's always two sides to a story. Sometimes there's 3 sides to a story, 4 sides to a story. At the end of the day, we are more alike than different. And it is heartbreaking what humans are willing to do to other humans because they believe that they are superior or that they are different from them, when the reality is that we're all very similar at the end of the day. And sadly, that is something I don't think that we've learned throughout history. And so we continue to have these wars. With that being said, I'm going to tell you what books are written from an Israeli or Jewish perspective and which books are written from a Palestinian perspective. And then, like I said, I recommend doing a mix and kind of bouncing back and forth so that you can remain a little bit, try to remain unbiased in your opinions as you go. I pretty reliably will read one book and be like, oh, I totally understand where they're coming from. And then I read a book from another perspective and I'm like, oh, I totally see where they're coming from. And I think for me, that's been the right way to do it. A book that I want to recommend is A Song for the Brokenhearted. I just finished this. I loved this book, and I also highly recommend it as an audiobook because there is some musical components that they include that are kind of like an extra bonus in the audiobook. And since this book is about music, it just adds to the overall experience. In this book, we are flipping between past and present, and we are following 3 generations of Jewish women. These women come from a line of Yemeni people who were taken out of the country of Yemen and brought into Israel and assimilated there. So that I think the ultimate goal being to bring Jews all together into like one promised land or whatever. So we start out with the great-grandmother who is immigrating from Yemen to Israel. We see her going to like a refugee camp and then becoming a citizen in Israel, settling, going through like a name change, assimilating into the Israeli like Jewish culture, which was a little bit different from the Yemeni culture. And so despite the religious beliefs being the same, the living day-to-day culture is different. And we see her assimilate into that culture and how that affects her posterity, how that affects her daughter and then her daughter's daughter. And we're getting all 3 perspectives and bouncing between them. And we really learn a lot about what it is to be a woman in this culture, what women have been through in history to get us where we are today, and how women influence culture so much more than the world gives us credit for. I also think, I've got neighborhood kids like taunting my dogs. I had to go out and take care of it. So anyhow, I think that I was saying the book is making a statement about how women influence culture, also about how music influences culture. I think the author in the book is also making a statement about ways that you can resist in a subtle way. How even though sometimes when we look from the outside looking in, it seems like maybe women or those who are oppressed aren't doing anything to resist or to fight back, but they actually are in subtle ways that feel safe or feel realistic for them. And I really liked that insight. A book I would recommend reading directly after that one is Too Soon. And this is the flip side. This is a Palestinian author with a Palestinian main character or main characters. Again, we're following 3 generations of women in the same family. So great-grandmother down to the granddaughter. And in both of these stories, the granddaughters have immigrated to the United States. And so we see them in present day after immigrating and then going back to their home country and learning about their mother and their grandmother and their history, their roots, their heritage, where they came from, the true stories behind how they got to where they are. And in Too Soon, we are following an Arab woman in New York City who doesn't necessarily like to flaunt that she's Arab, especially post 9/11. And she doesn't want to be judged for that, but she ends up having an opportunity. She's a director and she has a chance to go back to Israel and direct a play that she feels will be very progressive for Palestinian women. And then we're following her mother and her grandmother's stories, both of which take place at least partially in Palestine and cover some of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict when Palestinians had to seek refuge and then eventually immigrate to America. And I thought it was a really interesting perspective and a great balance to the other side. And what I think is really interesting about both of these stories and reading them back to back, because they have a lot of similarities in that we're following, several generations, that we're dealing with 3rd generation women who have now immigrated to the United States and then who go back to their home countries and learn more about their heritage. But both of them also explore what is expected of women in their cultures, the mother-daughter relationship, how trauma is passed down through generations. And what's really fascinating is that both stories, even though they come from 2 different sides, both stories cover families who are immigrants, who are refugees. There's 2 primary religions, and I think it's interesting how both sides have utilized religion to justify the way that they treat each other. So that's as much as I'll say. I would love for you guys to read the books and come up with your own opinions. I don't want to tell you what to think. I just want you to have this experience through reading books. Okay, another book that I read is The Book of Longings, which you may have heard of before. The Book of Longings is from the perspective of a loved one of Jesus and following his life through her eyes in this retelling. Why I think it is a great story to read right now is because so much of Middle Eastern history is based on religion and the Bible and the stories of the past. And that is honestly what the biggest conflict is between Israel and Palestine, is a disagreement on which religion is true and what the implications of that religion is on their land and inheritance. Even though this isn't a modern day story, I think it gives historical context to everything going on. And again, it's from the perspective of a woman. It was very well researched by the author, Sumant Kid. She's a very well-known author. And it shows a lot of the status of women during that time. And it's interesting to compare the status of women during biblical times to the status of women now in these other books that I've been reading. So I do highly recommend reading this book. I learned a lot and I found it really interesting. It's like a speculative fiction because it's a retelling, but it's also posturing that something happened that hasn't been acknowledged or documented. And so it's kind of like a what if, like, here's Jesus's life and what if this was also true? And then the final book I can recommend, I read last year. It's a very short book. It's a literary fiction. You know, literary fiction generally is a character study, like to study about the human condition, about the way that people think and the way that they behave, and tends to be, I don't know, a little more intimate look at human beings. And Minor Detail is a very, very interesting literary fiction from the perspective of a woman again. And this is a Palestinian woman, and this is taking place in contemporary times. We are living life through her eyes as a Palestinian woman in Gaza during the Israeli conflict that is currently going on. And it can feel a little bit odd at times. There's these really grotesque kind of, oh my gosh, I've had so many interruptions. Okay, so my camera just was like, hey, you're out of memory, and stopped. So I had to clear some memory. Let me go back to the Minor Detail. So there are a lot of grotesque descriptions. It is slow paced because you are being immersed in the day-to-day life of a Palestinian woman. And so it's very insightful, it's very immersive, and the ending is something I will never forget. Regardless of your opinion about how it ends, the ending is making a statement, and I think that is the most powerful part of the book. But in order to understand the ending, you must immerse yourself in this woman's life and follow her, kind of see the world from her perspective. I think it's a very powerful book. It's short. You can read it in one sitting. I also listened to it on audiobook, and the audiobook was very good. So definitely recommend. Okay, the next book I want to recommend is The Island of Missing Trees, and we'll have several of this author's books on my TBR. This is a Turkish author who primarily writes Turkish stories. The only one of their books that I've read so far is The Island of Missing Trees, and this takes place on the island of Cyprus. And we are seeing a political conflict that has gone on for a long period of time, again, between two different sets of people. So there's civil disputes, there's, war actions happening. And amidst all of this, we are also trying to solve a murder mystery. And this book is really unique because an inanimate object takes on a personality. And so one of the perspectives of the book is coming from a tree. The tree has its own personality, its own perspective, its own POV in the book. That was very strange to me when I was reading the book, but it didn't bother me by the end, and I understood why we had that point of view and ended up ultimately really enjoying the book. I thought it was very insightful, very informative. It's another past and present, so past civil disputes going on the island between two different sets of people and the murder mystery, and then present day Turks who have immigrated from the island to England, and we're following the two timelines to solve this murder mystery and to learn more about the conflict and the history of the people. Very beautiful writing. Highly recommend the story. Again, just know that it's a little strange when you're reading that extra point of view, but just go with it. Just roll with it if you can. And I look forward to picking up more books by this author. And then the final fiction book I want to talk about is a speculative fiction. It's like a speculative magical realism fiction. It doesn't take place in any one specific country. There's theories about what country it represents. But quite honestly, it's about a civil war in a Middle Eastern country, and that could represent so many countries at different points in time. I feel like it's a very hard book to try to describe because it's kind of genre bending and has all these interesting elements. So I'm just going to read the description to you. This novel is about two young people, Saeed and Nadia, who fall in love in a city on the brink of civil war and must flee their home using magical, instantaneous doors that appear around the world. This book uses a speculative element to explore themes of migration, displacement, love, and identity as the couple navigates an uncertain future, moving from their war-torn city to various locations like London and San Francisco. It's praised for its commentary on the global refugee crisis and its unique magical realism approach to a contemporary issue. Again, this is another short book. It's very immersive. It's definitely a speculative fiction. It's like a what if, what if this happened? What if this was possible? And I love speculative fiction. I find it very fascinating and interesting to think about. It has been many years since I've read the book, and so I don't remember all of the details, but I do remember that my takeaway was I was very lucky to live in a country that wasn't ravaged by war and like civil disputes going on. And so I feel like it gave me a lot of insight into what other countries have gone through or may go through and the difficult decisions that come with that and how that affects people's lives and generations to come. And then lastly, I'd like to talk about some nonfiction books. I have 3 for you, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about them, but the first one is I Am Malala. I'm sure that you've heard about this book before, but if you haven't, this is a real story, a memoir of a young girl in Pakistan under Taliban rule. So the settings are very similar to the stories of Khaled Hosseini that I talked about at the beginning. But this is a real girl who lived in Pakistan. And because of her desire to be an educated girl and the way that she pursued that, she ended up being shot, but she survived. And this is her story. She has since become an inspirational speaker, and you can learn so much more about her and watch her inspirational speeches. But I felt like this memoir made me feel like I understood what it was like for her to live where she lived, the thing that she went through. And I feel like she portrayed the terror that those people felt on a daily basis. And again, has a lot of commentary on the oppression of girls and women. Yeah, and lots of insight into what it's like to live under Taliban rule. So I highly recommend her memoir. The next book I want to recommend is another memoir, and I just finished this one. It's called Hostage by Eli Sharabi, I believe. He is an Israeli man who lived on the border of Israel and Gaza when the recent conflict broke out on October 7th of 2023, when Hamas attacked Israeli citizens at a festival. They also, at the same time, came in and massacred families in different communities. So they have kibbutz there, which are like these kind of socialist communal communities that people choose to live in, where all of the neighbors live in this neighborhood and they share all of their resources, etc. It's called a kibbutz. There's several of them along the Gaza and Israel border. When Hamas's men came in on October 7th, they went into some of these kibbutz and they burned them down. They massacred the people and they took a bunch of hostages. And Eli was a hostage, and we follow his story. He survived. He was a hostage with them for over a year. So he was taken on October 7th of 2023, and he was released in February of 2025. So just last year. And he gives a very detailed account of his kidnapping, of everything that he endured. And even though you would think that this would be biased from the perspective of an Israeli, especially one that has every right to hold a grudge against the Palestinian people and against his captors, he has a unique ability, I think, as a person and as a writer, to understand and portray the nature of human beings, regardless of where we come from or what our beliefs are. Again, I really felt like his ultimate message was that we are more alike than we are different, and how damaging war and conflict is to humanity, no matter where you're from. It's a very harrowing account. He had a very, very rough, traumatic journey. And so trigger warnings, look them up if you need them. But I went into this story with very little knowledge of what it was about. Like, I didn't really know that much about it. I picked it up because it was awarded the Jewish Authors Award. I can't remember what it's called, but I'll put it on the screen. But there's basically an agency that tries to promote Jewish writers and keep Jewish literature alive, and it won the award for 2025. And so that's why I picked it up. I didn't really know that much about it, but I would recommend trigger warnings. Make sure you're in the right frame of mind and realize that this is a true story about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that's all I'll say on that, but absolutely stunning book. And I did give that one 5 stars. And then lastly, a book that I've already talked about on my channel. I did an entire reading vlog about it, but it's called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. And again, it is about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, but it's written by an Egyptian Canadian author. So he was born in Egypt. He lived his childhood through the Gulf Wars and then immigrated to Canada. So he has a really unique perspective of like the Middle East, his own personal experience growing up there, his own experience with war, and then his experience with being an immigrant and trying to integrate into Western civilization, and his observations of the way that we live, the way that we approach politics, the way that we approach world politics and international affairs. It's a very powerful read. And it is also very heavy and extremely heartbreaking, but could not be more relevant or wise. Yeah, I won't go on and on about it, but that is like a 6-star book for me. And it is one that I will probably reread again after I'm done with this kind of initial journey of diving into Middle Eastern literature, because it is so relevant to everything, everywhere, and the American role in all of it. And that is it, you guys. So those are all of the books that I have read that I can recommend. And stay tuned for a follow-up video where I will be going over books that I have not yet read that I would like to, that are on my TBR, to further my education and experience with the Middle East, with the history, with the culture, with the people, and the ongoing conflict that is pretty much always happening somewhere in that area of the world. So let me know if there are any books that you've read that fall into this category that you recommend, because there are a lot of books out there. I want to pick up the books that are, I want to make sure I'm reading the best ones, that I'm spending my time wisely, because I would like to also read other books on my TBR and read about other subjects. So if you have any recommendations, please put them in the comments below. If you've read any of these books, let me know your thoughts, or tell me if there's one that I talked about that you plan to pick up. And again, if you're new, please make sure you subscribe. I appreciate you all being here so much, and I'll see you guys in the next one.